Hey, Michael, thanks for joining. And really intended to go into too much detail tonight because I've been out gathering information, and I did spend a little time putting the Wikipedia version of Jim Jones on the timeline today. And I think that's probably interesting enough to have a conversation about. And I want to get your feedback on maybe the outline. And first, I wanted to play this clip of May. So let's see if I can do that. All right. So here she's talking about corresponding with a New York Times reporter and kind of their lack of integrity, which I think you'll probably find relevant.
I see it, and see if the news that comes out in the years to follow fits into my original opinions or conclusions on the matter. We're suffering here from an information overload on the West Coast to practically nothing in the Midwest, and a few articles trickling out on the East Coast. I'm getting telephone calls, with the exception of Washington Post, the New York Times. I'm getting calls around the country from people who are getting absolutely no news about the Guyana affair. And on the other hand, out here on the West Coast, of course, where the families are involved, the newspapers are filled with a lot of information, so that I have thousands of articles here, and now there are books coming out on the subject, and I'll try to put them into some order for you. Before I begin on that, I hoped to get out some letters for those of you that take the tapes every week for a long, long time, and wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. There's just too much mail and so many
Oh,
things
this is
coming
the wrong
down,
clip, Mike.
so I won't be able to get around to it.
Hang on, I gotta try. Oh, that is the right one. It didn't come out at the right time, so hang on. There we go.
See some information, and he said, do you have documentation? I was citing some things that I've put on the other two tapes and will in the future, and he wanted certain documents. Well, this is the way the New York Times works. They want documentation of the things I'm saying, yet they can write an article go on and on in this long December 4th article on the nonviolence of the Leighton family, and preach the philosophy of their minds, of the mother and father. They can go at length about that. And then, as a contradiction, repeat about the biochemistry, the germ warfare, the weapon systems, the missile systems, the chief of biochemistry of chemical warfare, and yet praise his family for their nonviolence. The major media is so full of these contradictions and bullshit. You have to separate always from what they say they are from what they do.
Yeah, so that's May kind of telling it like it is back in the day. So just refreshing to kind of hear her take on it and to understand that they were doing those same things back then. So I put together this outline, and I think for tonight, I just want to get your take on the direction, maybe some advice, and we can go through maybe the Wikipedia version of Jim Jones, which is kind of scandalous enough in its own right. But from an outline perspective, talking about this is like the second level that I want to get down to eventually underneath the Wikipedia version that May kind of brings out in her discussions.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to crank it up, I did take the opportunity to watch like the ABC News version of Jim Jones, and their hour documentary, kind of recap of what Jim Jones and the Guyana massacre was. And, it's so different from this story.
Yeah.
And the ties and everything else. I mean, it still, points to some things that I think are super relevant, because I do feel like a lot of the psychological things that are going on that certainly people like in his congregation experienced, and how that relates to like what people are experiencing as they go through like the COVID narrative and what's going on, and how they feel, and like the powerlessness of like what people are experiencing, and then like what Jim Jones congregation, and I think you know, like them going through that, and why would they do what they did?
Yeah,
It it
it's kind of
is
spot
super
on.
relevant.
It's right kind of in there with what we're seeing happen now. Let me see if I can move this. Yeah, there we go. Let's see if I can turn off that chirping. Okay. So that's kind of, I think the important part about this story is that how relevant it is and like a precursor to some of the things that are happening to us now. And if you can place those things in context of history, you can get a lot better understanding of the things that are going on. And Jim Jones, he just didn't come out of nowhere. He was connected, like he was really connected.
Yeah.
And then Jonestown, like there were operations that were like Jonestown. So this isn't the first like prisoner camp or concentration camp or utopia camp that occurred in the world. So we'll get into that probably later. And then Congressman Leo Ryan's mission down to Jonestown on the day of the massacre,
Yeah.
and then talk about the aftermath a little bit. And then like May is really talking about Mark Lane a lot, and he's a really interesting character. So I wanted to kind of honor her work on and with him over the years, because I think he's a pivotal figure to what's going on with Jonestown and what's going on with assassination cover-ups and handlers and like distracting people from reality, like becoming a sink for information that never finds the light of day.
Indeed. Yeah, I think it just in particular that idea of the suicide drills and how that relates to like people giving themselves these vaccinations and recommending it to other people when there's just no real evidence that it works, and there's this other evidence that it may not work, and the fact that like people are kind of in that circumstance, it's eerie.
It is. It's like stunningly familiar, similar, and ugly. So just to start the story, like really starts in 1955 when Jim Jones cranks up his ministry, but he was born in 1931, and of course he died on November 18th, 1978. And what is interesting, let me see if I can get this thing to the right place. There we go. Yeah. So is that he kind of fell under this influence of this guy, William Branham, and he was a faith healer minister. So that's the milieu that he kind of grew up in as his ministry. This guy, William Branham, claimed to be a prophet, and he was anointed, and he came to herald the second coming, of course. And some of his followers labeled his operation as a doomsday cult, which will be really familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And he was known to tell attendees at his church or at his revivals their name, address, and why they came for prayer, pronouncing them healed, during the session. So I don't know if you've seen this this little clip from Fletch Lives, but I'll play a little bit of it, and you can see kind of how the operation works.
To begin, immediate seating for the 5 o'clock service. Welcome, Senator. Praise the Lord. Bless you.
Bless you, bless her, bless him. Hallelujah.
Name, please.
Irwin Fletcher. Irwin M. Fletcher. Irwin Mahatma Fletcher.
Address?
7.
It's time for the 4,323rd edition of the Farnsworth Television Ministry with
Mimsy Carlisle, God's own songbird.
the heavenly feet of Damon Feather. Mr. Coco, the Ringtails Revivalists, the Bradley Family Singers, and Ted Medley and the band. And now, the host of our show, the ministry's founder and your friend, Mr. Good News himself, the Reverend Jimmy Lee Farnsworth.
I know that there's someone out there tonight who needs to step forward. Lida Pearl Schindley.
Me?
Lida Pearl, come on down here. Give her a big hand, folks. Make her welcome. All right. Bless you. God bless you. Lida Pearl, I know that you suffered a terrible tragedy when you lost Joe Bob in the merry-go-round accident at the state fair.
I did.
I also know that Joe Bob left you financially stable. But answer me this one question. Has all of them riches brung you happiness, child?
No, they haven't. I've sinned.
We've all sinned.
I know, but I've really sinned.
Oh, Lamb of God, please have her not mention my name.
Speak up. Say it aloud so that your soul might be cleansed.
I'm so ashamed. I slept with my best friend's husband.
You
Oh,
are
Lamb of God.
forgiven. Praise the Lord.
And I also slept with my Uncle James.
You are forgiven, child. Ladies and gentlemen, doesn't it take a tremendous amount of courage to come up here on nationwide cable hookup and confess to human frailties?
And I also shoplifted this
You've been
blouse from
forgiven.
Sherry, and I also stole
Demons out!
So it kind of goes on like that, but that's the kind of stuff that these guys were doing, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, he was ordained in this ministry, and this William Branham, he's a really interesting character. This Branham was baptized by Roy Davis, who was a national imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. They had a lifetime relationship. He launched Jim Jones and a bunch of other faith healer type guys who followed him, and followers of his teachings were portrayed in this film Colonia, which is the Colonia Dignidad, and I think that was in Bolivia, and it was another Jonestown type operation that nobody's familiar with, but just horrible, went on for years and years, torture camp. And he was involved in this latter rain movement, which I don't know too much about yet. So I'm still working on that, and got connected with this Father Divine and his peace mission movement. And later, when Father Divine passed away, he went to the funeral and tried to claim that he was the living incarnation of Father Divine, and that all the followers of that guy should follow him. And his wife chased him off the stage. So that's the kind of thing that he was doing at that point. So Jones had been performing these miracles, and sometimes they were revealed as a hoax. At one point, he drugged Irene Mason, and while she was unconscious, he put a cast on her arm. And when she regained consciousness, she was told that she'd fallen, broken her arm, and taken to the hospital. And in the subsequent healing service, she was healed. So just like Reverend Farnsworth, that's the kind of stuff he was doing. The healed person would pretend to cough up a tumor, which was actually a chicken gizzard. And he revealed those special revelations about their personal life. So they would go and do research. They would call the recruits' homes to give him superhuman power. So just like the Reverend Farnsworth. And so in 58, he went out to Philadelphia to visit this Father Divine to kind of learn more about how it was done. And he started implementing these practices, which began to take over like the members' lives. So it became more cult-like. Their finances, their social life, interrupting their marriages, like telling them who they could be with. And he's at the same time he started adopting minority children. And the group in Indianapolis, so they were in Indianapolis, they praised him for being this progressive socialist at a time when there was segregation and racial prejudice. He was out there adopting minority children, which in reality became a nightmare over time.
Yeah, so like he's essentially being the epitome of like what people are being told is the thing to do these days, right?
Yes, the latest thing. He's doing the
Yeah.
latest thing. He's the guy.
Yeah.
And then we move up to 1960, and he's separating from that latter rain movement because he's doing his own thing, and he wants to be more progressive. He attaches a communist label to himself, and they join this Disciples of Christ denomination that was headquartered in Indianapolis. And the mayor actually appointed him to the local Human Rights Commission, which is pretty interesting. And Jones, of course, ignored his advice to keep a low profile. He went on a campaign to glorify himself and get more followers. And I think you can see kind of where that's going. Maybe that was a mistake, Mayor, to do that. But this is all in Indianapolis, and he's really kind of blank in 1960 and 1962. But May says that he actually goes to Hawaii during this time. And curiously enough, he goes to the University of Hawaii, which just so happened to be where, at this same time, Stanley and Dunham was there meeting Barack Obama Sr. And having Barack Obama at the University of Hawaii at the East-West Center, which was sponsored. He was sponsored by a CIA program to bring African leaders for indoctrination to Hawaii. So that's one of my areas of investigation. That's pretty interesting. Yeah. So there's a lot of MK Ultra connections to what was going on at University of Hawaii at that time. And then in 62, he's saying that he's starting to get like messianic and doomsday-ish. He's worried about nuclear war, and he's read in Esquire that South America, this is Wikipedia, right? He read in Esquire that South America is the best place to be during a war. So he goes down there to check it out. He makes a stop in Georgetown, but he spends, I don't know, it was like 18 months or 2 years in Brazil. And Wikipedia just kind of glosses over that, like what he was doing in Brazil. He was just doing charity work. May says that he was being fed at the consulate, being put up, and that it was an operation. He just so happened to make a stop in Georgetown, Guyana, which I think at this time was still a British colony, so English speaking. And a lot of stuff going on down there around natural resources and insurgencies in South America. So other things to look into as we kind of move forward with it. Yeah, so he worked with the poor in the favelas. That's your Wikipedia version of what happened in Rio. And then in 64, they moved back, and he was ordained that Disciples of Christ minister. And yeah, they were all like more encompassing of his radical views at the time. So that it made sense for him to join those guys. And then in 1965, it started to get kind of hot in Indianapolis. And he moved a portion of his church out to San Francisco, to Ukiah, actually, Redwood Valley, California. And I think I have something on here, why it got hot. I'll find that in California. So in California, he took a job as a history and government teacher at an adult education school in Ukiah. And then he recruited people for the People's Temple out of his job, and he planted loyal members in the classroom, and he recruited about 50 new members from there in the first couple of months. and coaxed another 75 members of the Indianapolis crew to move out there to California. And then in 1968, the People's Temple was admitted to the Disciples of Christ, which was like 1.5 million person organization. So he was trying to draw more members out of that group, and he kind of played up being a member of that. And I didn't know this, but apparently Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover were members of this Disciples of Christ sect, which is pretty interesting. Very interesting characters. Yeah, interesting characters, right?
Some very powerful individuals in the very interesting positions.
Yes, yeah. So in 1969, he had about 300 people up at Ukiah, and reports began to surface of abuse up there at the compound, and he, began promoting communism, which he called apostolic socialism, whatever that means, and making claims of his own divinity. So he became claiming that he was godlike, and became much more controlling of his members, which they had 3,000 people at the peak, and he engaged them in a communal lifestyle. They turned over their income, their property to Jones and the Temple, who directed all aspects of their life. So very, very kind of cult life intensive. And
They will own nothing and be happy.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Imagine that. Yeah. And well, you get free room and board. Oh, nice. And if you work outside the temple, you get to turn your income over for the benefit of the community. It sounds very Scientology-ist, kind of like a little Scientology or other cults. And if they rebelled, they got reduced food rations, work schedules, harsh work schedules, ridicule, humiliations. So they had struggle sessions like the Communist Party in China, and sometimes they were beaten or subject to physical violence. And May kind of actually goes into that on Jonestown, saying that small engine planes routinely came in and picked people up who were injured from working in the field, but it was too routine to be just regular injuries. And he created an armed security crew to ensure that they had order and for his own personal safety. And that's the crew that kept things together once they got down to Guyana.
Yeah.
So yeah, they had a bunch of different branches. Eventually in 1970, they opened up, and I think they moved their headquarters to San Francisco, and he began to focus on the major cities. And yeah, he moved down there, became a radical protest movement place. So he kind of entrenched himself with the San Francisco government because he had a ready labor pool to go out and campaign and to protest or flash mob places where they needed it. He had cult members to go down there and take care of business.
Yeah.
So he became kind of popular with the local authorities. And we'll have to fill in some of the blanks around here exactly what was going on, but it starts to get hot for him in California as well, because they uncovered the stage healings and the abusive treatment. And they claim that he raped a male member of the congregation in 1973. And yeah, they reported it to the local police, but the local police just buried it. So obviously he had some swing. And shortly after, they made more accusations and accused everyone of being homosexuals and questioned their true commitment to socialism. Heaven forbid you're not truly committed to socialism, and left the temple. And he thought that he was kind of losing control and thought that he needed to relocate. So what better way to get away from all this than, he had already moved from Indianapolis to California, and now he had to move out of California. But he was arrested for inappropriate behavior with a LAPD vice squad officer in a movie theater restroom. Sounds like that guy. What was his? I forgot what that congressman's name was, who was caught out in the restroom soliciting in the men's restroom. Sounds familiar to that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
of cou-
I do recall that, but I do not recall the guy's name.
so they dismissed the charges, of course, and they sealed the court files. Heaven forbid you get to see that. What was going on
Well,
there?
this is kind of one of those things where like this megalomania starts to like take hold of Jim Jones, and I would say that this is kind of one of those areas that this is how you get these kind of crazed individuals that do these wild things, is they start to feel like they're like super.
Yeah, they are divine. They can do whatever they want.
They're uncatchable.
Yeah, untouchable and uncatchable.
Yeah.
So they had, 2,500 members and 36,000 subscriptions to their fundraising newsletter. So they had power and money.
Yeah.
And they kind of went down and started the Jonestown. They sent an advance team down there a couple years in advance to build the infrastructure, 1973. And then
Yeah, and this is where you don't really know what exactly is going on down there, right?
no, I mean, he can hide, he can do whatever he wants, hide it out. It's kind of like a CIA black site, right? It's like
Yeah.
not subject to, like Guantanamo Bay, right? Not subject to any rules or laws, and freedom from oppression from the United States government, and yes, except for the people who were oppressed there.
Mhm.
So in 1975, Mayor Moscone, George Moscone, appointed Jones to the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission. And they were really influential in George Moscone's campaign for mayor in 1975 by getting out the vote and getting out and whipping up the fervor for Mayor Moscone in the temple, getting out people to vote. So he was like well supported in the San Francisco leadership, and we'll see a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, in general, democratic cities are one in which there's all kinds of scams going on, especially with voting. And, just being able to like build a crowd of people for a lot of these bullshit politicians is something that's important to kind of fool people into believing that they're actually the winner.
Yeah, they're popular, right? They're apparently you didn't have to do that in the last election. You just turn the computers on and switch a few numbers and you're done. I mean, that's all it takes. So maybe they're getting away from that. But so this goes into like, this is his Moscone's, or Harvey Milk. He was a board supervisor who was later assassinated. He's saying, and there, I have all these positive statements about him off to the side, but he's saying, Jones is widely known in the minority community here and elsewhere as a man of the highest character, has undertaken constructive remedies for social problems, been amazing in their scope and effectiveness. And he wrote this letter to Jimmy Carter 7 months before the massacre. And it was to kind of aid and abet his powerful supporters' abduction of a 6-year-old boy. So that's another story, because they started funneling people to him, kids and people who needed housing, and they started funneling people to the temple, and Jones would have temple members become their legal guardians, and that's how he got paid, right? He would take their Social Security money or their disability payments or whatever they were getting from the government, and that's how they made a bunch of money, or how they kind of funded a lot of their operations. But at the time, here's Jim with Rosalind Carter, right? He was popular. He was a left-wing advocate.
Was the first lady.
Yeah, that was
to be the first lady.
She was, I think, the first lady at the time. And it's funny, they, in the background of this picture, it has Bill Maher's poster back in there. And then here's Jerry Brown, the governor.
The two-time governor.
Yeah. So he was connected, and he hosted these people at his apartment for discussions. And Willie Brown, Kamala's boyfriend, was the master of ceremonies at the testimonial dinner for Jones, attended by Jerry Brown. the lieutenant governor, and Willie says, Jones, what you should see every day when you look in the mirror, that's what you should see in Jim Jones. He's a combination of Martin Luther King, Angela Davis, and Albert Einstein, and Chairman Mao. And Milk told the audience, Jim, it may take me many a day to come back down from the high I reached today. I found something very dear today. I found a sense of being that makes up for all the hours and energy placed in the fight. I found what you wanted me to find. I shall be back, for I can never leave. So Milk is, these people are just like hook, line, and sinker, sucking this stuff down.
Yeah. And of course, Milk turns out, he's become
folk hero,
almost holy figure at this point.
Yeah, he's a folk hero. And the Moscone and Jim met privately with Walter Mondale on his campaign just before the 1976 election, leading Jones to publicly praise the temple. So or Mondale. So we have those quotes, and Rosalind met with him on multiple occasions, corresponding with him about Cuba. And
so within the Democratic structure, he's basically talking to the top people.
Yeah, he is connected, and this is in 1976. So in 77, that's when they're still getting like articles of physical and emotional abuse. Like they're getting a whiff of him. But much like the whiff that we're getting of Democratic leaders in corruption and inappropriate, shall we say, at the very least behavior, all this stuff gets just snowed under and covered under. But about 600 of the followers arrived, and 400 later in 1977, and he began moving the assets down there to Jonestown, so selling things off. And I guess they had $10 million, which $42 million in 2020 dollars. He had a lot of negative press, but he was still respected outside of the temple for his racially integrated church, which helped the disadvantaged. So 68% of Jonestown residents were Black. So never mind that he killed them all and was abusing them and using them and had them in a cult. He was very respected. So this guy, Tim Stone, who was with the cult at one point, and apparently his family was caught up in it, and he must have like signed his son over to Jones or something because they couldn't get his son back from Guyana. And he went to Congress, he went to the State Department, and that was what Harvey Milk, I think, was writing about to President Carter was, hey, Jones is the best parent for this guy, this kid. You can't send him back to his other parent. Never mind, he was subsequently killed the next year in Guyana. And he aroused the curiosity of Leo Ryan, and Leo Ryan wrote letters, and they formed this Concerned Relatives, which became a legal battle over the Stone son, this guy, Tim Stone. And so things were like heating up. So then in summer of 78, he hired Mark Lane and Donald Freed, who were kind of handlers around the JFK assassination evidence and witnesses. And at the same time as this is going on, Mark Lane actually queued up the Assassination Review Board. I think it was in 78, where they had all of the MLK, the JFK, the RFK. They reinvestigated all those congressional committee, that the Congressional Assassination Committee. I forgot exactly what it's called, but I'll have that later. And he set that up, and then he left. Like Lane set it up, and then he left that thing, disappeared. And one of Mark Lane's clients was James Earl Ray. And at the time, James Earl Ray had escaped from prison, right? So he was unavailable to testify. and then they apparently they recaptured him, but Mark Lane being his lawyer, you would think that he would want to testify at his defense, but he kept him out of the hearings. So he kept them at bay, and May goes into some detail on that relationship, and also the relationship of the woman who was at the rooming house where James Earl Ray was supposedly shot MLK from, and that witness, and I'll have to come up with her name later, was imprisoned in a mental hospital for 8 years prior to this assassination review board congressional committee, and she was not allowed to testify either. And they were talking about, they have Lane on tape talking about getting one of the people in Guyana's passport so this witness could go to Guyana and disappear. So that's the kind of stuff that was going on. And at the same time, Jones, he's getting increasingly more crazy and taking drugs, and he's worried about a raid on the commune. And then he has these drills, which he calls white nights, and he would call an alert. One of these drills lasted for 7 days. He would call the community together to the pavilion, and the guards with the guns would surround them, and they would have drills. And one drill, he had the Kool-Aid drill, right? They would just say that they were, we're surrounded and we have nowhere to go, and we're going to be decimated. So we're going to take this Kool-Aid, and they kind of watched like who took it and who didn't take it, and they kind of knew who was on the team and who wasn't. And to me, that's very apropos to what's going on now, right? Who's going to drink the Kool-Aid and who's not drinking the Kool-Aid? And it's very much the same thing. Are you willing to inject yourself, or do we have to come by and inject you forcibly? Because that's what they did to a large majority of the people down there. And I don't know if you can see this photo, but like, can you imagine, like, how do the people end up like that and lined up in a row for face down, everybody for photography? Obviously they were placed there. And so apparently Jones's 3 sons, they were off with the basketball team on the boat in Georgetown, so they escaped, but a lot of the family members didn't make it. And
well, that was part of his security team, right?
Yeah,
so there was a part of his security team that was, the guys that basically took care of all of his problems. They're out of the country when this big situation happens.
Yeah, and they don't have to go down.
I've heard that interview with, because I believe 2 of them was Jones's son, and they say, if we would have just been there, we would have been able to stop it. Like, like he just lost his mind, and this is what, so I know that's probably propaganda, but it's interesting that's kind of part of the narrative.
Yes, and
official narrative.
It is. And this is a audio of, they call it the death tape, and I think it's Jim Jones talking about what's happening on that day. That comes from Wikipedia, so that's an interesting listen. And it's just very curious that, okay, Leo Ryan arrived, they didn't think that he could make it down there, like he would ever get there. He didn't have the support of the State Department. They didn't provide protection for him. They didn't warn him what was going on and that he was really going down to a death trap. But he wanted to protect his constituents, and something like he was going to take like 7 or 9 people back out of there, which is all the plane could hold. And they didn't want that information to get back, so they whacked him on the runway. And then later the guy who did it, confessed, and they have his testimony. And so they had these suicide drills when they had all these drills, and then it just went operational at some point.
Yeah.
And now they have this, like San Diego State has a Jonestown Institute, which students learn about Jonestown in a non-judgmental way, right? So yeah, because it publishes like his Soviet style 5-year agricultural plan, the industry schemes, and the utopian fantasy world that they have down there, and so they're apologists for the massacre. So that is like, if that's not bad enough, right? This is the Wikipedia version of what happened. And if that's not bad enough, then May just peels it down to a whole different layer underneath this thing that you will just be amazed when we gather that stuff up. And that's kind of what I'd like to do next week, is hit that second level layers of connections underneath these things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's certainly some things here that, like, when you that alert part, that's something that, like, if you're in the military, certainly in the military from the 1980s, and like you went to Europe or you did any of the rapid deployment force, there's that alert status where
Yeah.
they create these circumstances where, like, they make you think that the war is going to, like, okay, we're minutes away from like total disaster. You get your stuff, we're going to war, and even if you look at some of the old, I was watching a old 60s era TV show about Marine Corps.
Yeah.
And they just like, get on the airplane, we're going to war, and this was peacetime America in 1960.
Right.
And it's this, like, you don't know if this is real or if this is some bullshit. And of course it was just, oh, this is just training.
The Transportation Security Administration has declared a code orange for the airport. Any bags you leave around will be confiscated and seen as a threat to the facility. Please be alert. See something, say something, right?
Yeah. So this is that slippery slope that that to a large degree, I think this is where they tested that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? That the parallels, and that they're just recycling these things. And what I'm seeing in this work is that strategy of tension, that Operation Gladio, that domestic terrorism support, and bringing them financial money and mind controlling them in prison and turning them loose on the population so that they can get funding, so that they can keep everyone afraid and keep publishing or keep getting funded. And at the same time, you have all of the propaganda of the television and the radio and the patriotism, and you don't see these basically MK Ultra Nazi ties and strategies that are happening right in front of our eyes.
Yeah.
So being able to see this happen in the 60s and 70s and connect it to what's happening today, I think is really important and relevant.
Well, and I, like the thing about the political events and stuff like that, because you've got, like the 68 Chicago Democratic Convention is, pretty much, there's like 10 or 20,000 people there, and like 2/3 of them are informants that they bust from all over the country to make this, so and of course now you got the the Black Lives Matter protest and all that kind of stuff. And within the FBI, it's pretty clear that they have a informant system where they're paying a huge number of people. Somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 million is allocated for informant per year to the FBI, and they're not paying a whole lot of money to people, but they're paying, you know, maybe $1,000 a month. And these people are, you know, like this impressionable people. And,
Yeah, they're vulnerable and they're impressionable, and they need the money, and you know they're open to being controlled.
yeah, but they provide that kind of evidence that, you know, oh, there's these people doing this, or there's these people doing that, and yeah, there's a mob of these people, but they're there because they're getting a paycheck.
Yeah, yeah, and well, how do you think the bricks show up prior to the protests? Like, where do those come from, and how do the like buses with the uh pre-printed uniforms and flags and banners and you know come and get your stuff, right? Where does
Yeah.
the money for all that come from, and who organizes all that? That's the kind of thing that May would be kicking them in the teeth on.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is the letter that Harvey Milk wrote to Jimmy Carter, and just looking at this will make your stomach churn a little bit, because he's saying that you know, Jones is widely known in the minority communities here. He's a man of highest character. Our own board of supervisors presented the Reverend Jones with a certificate of honor unanimously passed by all members, praising the church for its many projects which have been so beneficial to the citizens of the Bay Area, and on and on. And he's saying that you know, Timothy and Grace Stone, they're trying to damage Jones's reputation and disrupt the life of his son. And he's been discredited in the news media, and his son was down there in Guyana, kind of as being hosted, or I think he actually lived in Jim Jones's house. And he's saying that, you know, Grace was involved in a blackmail attempt against another leader of the minority community. And so he's kind of defaming the Stone family, and then saying, oh, the fact that he could even think of flaunting his situation in front of our congressmen with the bold-faced lies, and that he pressured these congressmen towards unwittingly compliance with promoting State Department intervention in the custody case now pending in Guyana. Not only is the life of a child at stake, who presently has loving, protective parents in Reverend and Mrs. Jones, but our official relations with Guyana stand to be jeopardized. So, Mr. President, the actions of Mr. Stone need to be brought to a halt. It's offensive to most in the San Francisco community and all those who know Reverend Jones to see this kind of outrage taking place. So that's Harvey Milk going to bat.
What's the date on that?
For Jim Jones. February 19th, 1978. So
Jesus,
yeah, yeah. So that's like, this is the Wikipedia version. So what I want to kind of dig into a little bit more, I didn't have, I've been gathering the sources, but I didn't have time to craft a story. So I put the timeline together today. But I really want to get to his CIA MK Ultra connections. I think we covered his liberal Democrat connections in Rosalind Carter. I think this is an example of the right wing setting up the left, just like the left wing set up the right here recently. They do false flags, and they have lifetime actors who cause havoc, and then they blame it on their political opponents, just like Lee Harvey Oswald was a double agent and claimed to be, you know, he was setting himself up as a communist, and Charlie Manson was setting himself up as a hippie, but he wasn't a hippie, right? He was a felon, prisoner, insane MK Ultra guy. And then getting the parallels to the past, kind of how the Nazi camps work and the FEMA camps. And then, okay, their adoptions, well, actually it's human trafficking is what it is, right? It's trafficking and sexual and physical and mental abuse, slavery, really, I think is cult slavery is what it amounts to. What was his trip to Brazil? What was he doing down there? What was his connection to Dan Matrone and other handlers? And what the hell was he doing at University of Hawaii with Stanley and Dunham? Like, why at the same time she was there,
Yeah.
and what kind of experiments were going on at Jonestown. It does look kind of Mangala style, and Mangala was supposedly escaped and was in South America running these things like Colonial Dignidad.
Yeah, that may be the Brazil connection,
Yeah, and that she did a lot of work on Colonial Dignidad, and that is even more mind-blowing and frightening than the assassination squads and what kind of connection do they have to, like Noriega, to drug running or to weapons running, to the insurgencies that they were fomenting in South America over that time in the
Absolutely.
60s and 70s.
Yeah, well, like these, the terrorist squads that are, that run rampant in Guatemala and Honduras these days, and where do these crazy lunatics come from that chop people's heads off and chop people's arms off and stuff like that?
Yeah,
These-
I mean, here we have an epidemic of unlikely suicide called Arkancide, and how does that connected? Like these political murders, how are they connected?
Mhm.
Then what May's saying is that the death estimates kept going up and up and up because they flew over and they saw 200 or 300 bodies. So where was everybody else? And the implications are that people tried to flee into the jungle and they were collected back up and injected rather than sipping the Kool-Aid. Then how about Leo Ryan's mission? Like, how is he connected? And why was that bad that he was down there? What was he going to come back with? Who actually killed him? And what's his connection to Colonial Dignidad and the Nazi connections in South America? And that's a pretty deep rabbit hole. And talking about some of the aftermath in San Francisco politics, because Harvey Milk and Mayor Moscone, they were assassinated. Willie Brown became Kamala Harris's mentor, right, and boyfriend, right? And how about the Symbionese Liberation Army connections? May goes into that a little bit. The connections to mind control at Vacaville Prison, the connection to the CIA. She wrote a big article called "The SLA is the CIA," which is really, really fantastic article. They had the death squads down there, but nobody was prosecuted. And she goes into, they only did autopsies in like 7 bodies. Why were they left to rot in the sun face down? They actually used some of the bodies for fingerprint experiments and some of the other things they did with the bodies. Where did the money come from? And how was Mark Lane involved in covering up the whole thing? And I knew she had a beef with Mark Lane because I had heard her speak about that before, but I didn't really understand in detail like what his role was, because I read his book, Rush to Judgment, which came out pretty quickly after the JFK assassination. And I thought it was a really good book. Like he asked all the right questions, but I find out that he was either a naval intelligence or an OSS officer in World War II, and that he's connected. And I think maybe these people, they get their street cred with one artifact of legitimate work, and then they end up turning, they become a sink for information. It's just like he and the Penthouse guy, Larry Flint, they offered a reward for information around the assassination committee hearings in 1978. They offered witnesses a reward to come forward, and then those people started like disappearing or getting whacked or having unfortunate Arkancide accidents. George DeMorenshield's dead. Johnny Rosselli's floating in a barrel in Miami Bay. Santos Traficante gets whacked. There's a whole list of people who get whacked, and where's all that evidence, right? They just hoovered it all up and stored it away. So that deflection. So that's kind of
and that kind of ties in with social media and how much today that same situation occurred now. It's crazy, and I mean that's probably why they're so bold.
What do you mean with the social media? I lost you there for a second.
Well, I mean, like being able to connect 70s, basically had to kind of volunteer that information. There had to be people that collected that information. Now they can just, word search
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Facebook profiles, and they can collect the people, and when everybody's getting injected with stuff, it's
Yeah,
real easy to give people the right injection or the wrong injection. You know what I mean?
absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. Like the surveillance and the information gathering and the totalitarianism is just kind of become exponential on top of all of this over time. And it's, uh, I mean, I'm fascinated connecting the dots. It's also very frightening at the same time. So you have to figure out how to live with the knowledge of what you know.
Yeah, it's just man, it's truly amazing, man. I really appreciate you bringing this to our attention. And I know everybody can't be doing this, and I think that's one of the reasons that this is really a powerful tool, is to be able to kind of bring this all together in one place. And for those that want to take the time to do the further investigating, now we can kind of pool those resources into something much more you
Yeah.
those that can't do that.
Yeah. It's, I like the brain model, and I really like for storing information, but it's hard to present on it. And this makes it a nice place to both store and present. It's a truly like a crime board. And you can and I'm still working and learning and how to put the connections together. And the timeline came up today. Like, I didn't really know Jim Jones. I didn't know what he was up to. And just going through the Wikipedia version was helpful. Now I can put some context around the next layer that May goes into in her talks, and she does 4 hours of it. So there's quite a bit, and I captured a bunch of it down here, but I just couldn't synthesize it and organize it, I think, without this timeline. Like that's going to be really helpful.
Yeah, excellent work.
Well, I appreciate you guys coming, showing interest, and contributing and encouraging the work. It's really fascinating, and I think it's, there's 2 of us here, but 3 of us here, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. So people are going to
No,
see this stuff.
This is
Yeah.
incredibly valuable, and I know there's a lot of things going on in the world, and a lot of things to be doing, and certainly that's that's to be considered in the small community that we have and all the things that we're involved in.
Yeah.
But still, this is important stuff.
I see these things like stringing through time directly to what's happening now. So we can make those connections to drinking the Kool-Aid, to agreeing to take an experimental shot from a company that would just as soon see you dead. So that's quite a parallel.
Right. And the psychology behind that, to kind of create the wording and the stuff that makes that so that people, like, they're confident that people are going to do it, and the kind of the mental box that they've got to get people in to kind of create the circumstance that, oh yeah, we can do this.
Oh, it's amazing. And it's amazing that all the advertising and the propaganda came out at the same time globally, right? That had to be prepared years in advance, and the whole scheme had to be prepared years in advance. It's like on 9/11, when every media outlet had the same story and the same pictures and the same photos. It's like, okay, well, that's had to be coordinated in advance. There's just no way. So
Yeah.
just being able to use your critical thinking in situations like this can save you from some pretty bad outcomes. That's the idea anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Because they're certainly interested in creating that hysteria and that confusion and that critical moment when people are confused and they have to make a choice. It's important to be able to step back from that situation.
Yeah, and that's why I really appreciate the work that you and Bob are doing on the mass hypnosis, and it fits directly with this. and it's so relevant. If we can create a trap door where people can escape, it's going to be invaluable.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, gentlemen, thank you for being with us. I think next week we'll just try to peel back Jim a little bit further, and it looks like a 3 or 4 week effort to get through these guys. Maybe more, but hopefully it'll be continue to be really interesting. There's a lot of really good material, so I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks so much, Tim.
Thank you, guys.